Hello and welcome to the 7th video of this Risk Blueprint. Today, we'll talk about internal controls, design and testing. With an outline in 3 sections, we'll cover the different types of risk response, the feature of good control designs, and a control testing program. So let's start with the 4 types of risk response encapsulated by the 4 T's for tolerate, treat, transfer, or terminate. Tolerate a risk is simply accept it without any further action. Treat is where the controls lie, either preventative controls, detective or corrective, that will reduce the likelihood or the impact of the risk, or both. The risk transfer is to place it in a different party, typically an insurance or a third party. The termination of the risk is the strictest risk response when you terminate the exposure because none of the other responses are available or acceptable. So we will focus here on the risk treatment in the form of control types. If you remember the video on risk taxonomy, we took as the level 1 of the taxonomy of controls the categories delivered by the Institute of Internal Audit. Controls can be preventative, detective, corrective, or directive. Preventative controls take place before the events. They aim at reducing the likelihood of the events by tackling its cause. That would be like segregation of duties or authorizations in the limitations of errors or fraud. Detective controls, like the name indicates, detect the events but reduce its impact by early detection. A typical example for that is a fire alarm. The quicker you detect a risk that propagates very quickly, the more effective you are at reducing this impact. And that leads us to the third very important category of controls that has been neglected for many years in operational risk, but now has really come up with the flow of resilience and DORA regulations, etc., which are the corrective controls that take place after the event, sometimes just after the event, and are aimed at reducing the impact. They're very effective at reducing the disruptions impact, and that's part of the resilience, but also the so-called non-financial impact, reputation, customer damage, regulatory embarrassments, etc. And this is a place where the mitigation of operational risk has really taken on, let's say, over the last 10 years, initially with cyber risks and later on with various types of disruption risk, COVID being one of them. And then finally, you have a very important element, types of controls in the directive controls. And these are the governance rules. We had a video on governance, policies, guidelines, but also training. Training is a part of a directive controls. By empowering people, by guiding them on what to do and what to do better, you de facto reduce your level of non-financial risk. Examples of these controls, and that can be the first layer of your control taxonomies. I'll let you read them all, and I encourage to download the slides after these videos. But I want also to show you by these very concise synthetic examples that you don't need taxonomies of dozens of controls. You just need high-level principle-based controls like access, digital or physical, policies and guidance, exceptions reporting, detective controls, complaints handling process and compensation to affected parties in terms of corrective controls. So do not hesitate to have these very high-level controls defined in order to highlight what impacts do they have in the mitigation of your incidents in order to really concentrate on the controls that matters. One observation I had over and over in the industries working there for decades is controls may not be, and sadly often are not, very effective. And that leads us to the topic of poor control designs. These are controls that are conceptualized so poorly that it really kills their effectiveness. And they can be dangerous because they can provide you with a false sense of security even though they're not effective. I would classify 3 types of controls in these categories: the so-called optimistic control, duplicative controls, or more of the same. Optimistic ones are the controls that rely on incredible level of motivations or capability of the controllers to function properly. These would be accepting the terms and conditions. Who reads the 90 pages of terms and conditions? And we know these are, legal risk financial net, but they don't really make any other differences than a tick box. The validation of policies or the sign-off on of a lot of documents by people who are not inclined to read the policy, and this is quite connected to the notion of duplicative controls. I'll come to that. In the optimistic controls that are rules or contracts, I come from a lawyer family. I'm very sensitive to contracts, but many of them are not enforceable. And even though hours and hundreds of hours are dedicated to highlight contracts that you won't use in practice, but also controls where the controllers doesn't have the proper information to sign it off. They can be very, very damaging. And linked to that, you have the notions of duplicative controls when you have several people checking the same thing. You know the principle of the 4 eyes. You have a maker checker, but these 4 eyes often multiplies in 6 eyes, 8 eyes, 10 eyes, where everyone is relying on everyone else to check the document or the information or whatever needs to come out or be executed. And the results of that is that it dilutes accountability, and you might end up in a situation when the risk is actually higher the more controllers you have. And I do have many concrete examples of these in organizations. And then finally, you have the more of the same. And just one example that is also linked to my example number 2 is when you have a control failure and you respond with a reinforcement of the same controls that have failed in the first place. And I'll share just one example of a firm I know well who had a failure of an information going to customers because they had 2 controllers at 2 different parties actually, and person A was counting on person B to check, and vice versa. So no one paid attention and the wrong information went out to customers. And they responded to more of the same. They responded by adding a 3rd controllers. And sure enough, same cause, same effects. The dilution of accountability was now between person A, B, and C. And then the event reoccurred until they changed the design of their mitigation. And so there is not only me saying that, there's a whole field of literature, especially in risk management in engineering, called prevention through design. It is where you redesign your controls and your processes, importantly, so that people are not set up for failure, because humans are fallible. And one of the leaders in this literature is James Reason, and you see the quote here in his famous paper that led to the so-called Swiss cheese model. I'll take you through in a minute. We cannot change the human condition, but we can change the conditions under which humans work. And the idea is to accept human fallibility. People will make mistakes, it's a given. And if you don't want the mistake to be made, you have to design your process so that it's impossible for this mistake to take place. And in order to have very reliable systems, which is very much risk management in engineering 101, you have the notion of layering of controls. And when you layer your controls, you want to layer independent controls, meaning controls that fail independently due to different causes, so that the holes of your layers of Swiss cheese, i.e. the holes in the layers of your controls, are not aligned. And I'll give you one very simple yet powerful numerical example to show you that the independence between your controls, and more specifically the independence between your different control failure rates, matter more than the reliability of your controls themselves. And So in this case here, imagine 4 key controls. So 4 controls that are sufficient to stop an incident. It can be an intruder in an office building where you have a guard at the entrance, when you have a physical badge, when you have a camera, when you have awareness of people against tailgating or the check for the lanyard. And imagine that each of these controls fail at 10% of the time. 10% is quite a high failure rate. But if all these controls fail independently, the joint probability of failure, so the likelihood of having an intruder in your important office building, for instance, is 10% to the power 4. 10% times 10%, 4 times for the 4 layers of control. That's 1 in 10,000. So you have quite a reliable process with 4 weak-ish controls. Now, if all these controls fail, i.e. if the guard at the entrance doesn't see it and then the cameras doesn't pick it up, or if the camera says it's okay, none of the controls are implemented, or if your badge is there and it gives you access to all the room without different restrictions, there is no diversification effect in the effectiveness of your controls, and your failure rate stays at 10%. So you see in this simple example that fully dependent control, failure rate 10%, fully independent controls, failure rate 1,000 times less. So that has important consequences, and lots of firms are oblivious to that actually. Lots of consequence in the design of your controls. So don't only test the controls independently, but also test the independence between these controls. And this is the Swiss cheese model of James Reason that is called academically the cumulative act effect, which is a little less marketing friendly. And so that leads me to the important topic of the control testing. First of all, you have different types of controls. Testing, the first one, the more powerful one, is reperformance. That would be mystery shopping. That would be redo a process or redo a calculation and check with the same numbers and check if the results of the model is the same. This is what is recommended by the Institute of Internal Auditors, by the Risk Management Institute, as the only acceptable control testing for high level of operation risks, so risks that are inherently high, and controls that tackles these high inherent risks. The second one is examination, is very much the checking of documents. It's a typical internal or external audit methodology when you review the documentary proof of the controls. And then you have the observation, the physical observations. That would be the physical observation of a badge, a lanyard, a guard in the entrance of the building in my example. And the weakest one is the inquiry, which is not really a control testing. Is, do you have a control? Yes. Does it work? Yes. This is the pinky promise type of control testing that is only that could only be reserved to the low level of inherent risks. And just to finish, I want to take you through some of the principles of a good control testing program. You want the people to test the controls to assess their effectiveness and design to be independent, and that's clearly the role of auditors, but it can also be the role of an independent internal control units. You have lots of organizations, especially in the financial industry, who have such departments. Controls are rated in design and in effectiveness. If the design is poor, there's no point testing the effectiveness. Redesign your control. The scope of the control tested needs to be defined. The frequency of testing will depend, of course, of the nature and the criticality of the control. If it's an automated control, you test it a lot less often than if it's a manual control. And finally, the sample size. What is the sample you use for the transactions, for instance, the control transaction that needs to be tested? That really depends also on homogeneity. If it's the same program for all transactions, you can use a very small sample because data are very homogeneous. If you have a different process with different controllers and different nature of transactions. The data is quite heterogeneous, quite different from one another, so you need a much larger sample. So use both statistics and common sense to design your sample size. BDO has lots of resources on control design and testing, so please visit our website to know more.